I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of library lectures. We welcome students, colleagues, and invited guests here today to our House of Learning lecture with Professor Michael Tueller from the Department of Humanities, Classics, and Comparative Literature as our featured speaker today. His address is entitled, This or That. Or is it? Hellenistic Poets Address the Problem of Imitation. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lecture Series and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lecture Series title is taken from section 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's speaker. Professor Tueller earned an Arts Baccalaureate from Harvard University in Greek in 1992, graduating summa cum laude. He then completed a PhD in Classical Philology, also from Harvard, in 2003, and came to BYU that same year. While an undergraduate, Professor Tueller was Phi Beta Kappa and earned particular distinction as the two-time recipient of the Bowdoin Prize for translations of Attic Greek. In graduate school, Professor Tueller obtained several grants and awards, including the Charles Seagull Travel Fellowship and the Whiting Fellowship, both from Harvard. In 1996-97, Professor Tueller was an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in Humanistic Studies. He has published articles on voice in Greek literature and is currently working on an analysis of science and poetry with Professor Roger McFarlane. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Tueller is a role model for young minds, encouraging thoughtful inquiry, reasoned conclusions, and lifelong discipleship. It is a pleasure to welcome today our House of Learning lecturer, Professor Michael Tueller.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the library for inviting me to give this lecture and to thank you for coming. If I can get this started. We'll begin today with ancient philosophy and range all the way to modern art and back, using ancient Greek epigram as the vehicle. The quotation in my title comes from Aristotle's Poetics. Here, Aristotle justifies the imitative nature of poetry by appealing to human nature. People, he says, simply enjoy imitation, and especially the moment at which they make the imitative connection, when they say to themselves, ah, so this is that, as you see in the last line. Now, Aristotle was well aware that when viewing, say, a performance of Oedipus Tyrannus, he was not really seeing Oedipus, but rather an actor portraying Oedipus. Plato had emphatically made this point a generation earlier. Imitation, Plato taught, could never result in an artistic product that was identical to its ideal model. Aristotle does not respond to Plato's objections here. Rather, he points out that the imitative habit of mind is inevitable, no matter how much we know that the real Oedipus is not on stage, we cannot stop thinking or saying, "That's Oedipus on stage." Plato's arguments may be correct, but art and human instinct are still more persuasive. And so, we may think, a stalemate ensued for the next 2,000 years, until Magritte made an artistic entry into this philosophical issue. It is easy, Aristotle would say, to say, "This is a pipe." But that becomes less easy when the image is clearly inscribed, "This is not a pipe." The point is a simple one and not even particularly clever, but given the image's betrayal of its duties of representation and the viewer's battle with her instincts, it is nevertheless effectively made. Magritte, however, was anticipated in the literary arts. Only a generation after Aristotle, poets were retailing the same point to the reading public. Today we will examine their work. Before we begin, however, I would like to establish some terminology. When I look at this painting and say, "That is an image of a pipe," or "That is a painting of a pipe," I will say that I'm speaking in terms of representation. That is, I am saying that the painting represents a pipe. On the other hand, when I look at this painting and say, "That is a pipe," I will say that I'm speaking in terms of equation. I am equating the image with its model. In the 3rd century BC, the time was ripe for writers to point out the difference between representation and equation. The visual arts were changing the manner in which they represented, and a genre of literature was arising that dealt explicitly with descriptions of art objects. I will briefly characterize the revolutions in art and literature that were taking place at that time. Let us begin with the visual arts. When Aristotle said that a person would recognize a portrait, he meant that one could look at this image and say, "This is Pericles." But how would one say that? Is it because the features of this portrait look exactly like Pericles looked in life? Probably not. Though there was probably some personal resemblance, the key to recognizing that this is Pericles lies in shared character attributes. The firm brow, the controlled beard, the direct gaze, all are intended to encapsulate the intensity and clarity of purpose that Pericles demonstrated in life. The helmet on the head, half worn, shows that Pericles did not shy away from the use of military might. It also alludes to portraits of Athena, who always wears her helmet in this fashion, and thus implies that Pericles is strongly attached to his home city of Athens. In short, we know that this is Pericles because it looks like Pericles should look, not because it looks like Pericles did look. He's not real. He is an ideal, telling heroic features inscribed on an ideal body type. In the 3rd century BC, art took a sharp turn away from the ideal. Artists represented people as they actually appeared, warts and all, such as this drunken old woman. The new order of representation in artwork is described by a contemporaneous observer in this poem. This poem is particularly complex, and we will return to it later, but for now I want to focus on the description of the statue we see in the first 6 lines. Hecataeus molded this bronze completely equivalent to Philetus, precisely, down to the fingertips, hewing to the carpenter's square both in size and flesh. Human-wise, he didn't mix in any heroic ideal. Rather, he very carefully, with his whole art, modeled the elderly man, keeping to the strict standard of truth. The word modeled here in particular refers to the creation of a model by taking a wax impression. This process creates an exact duplicate of the form of its model. It is thus impossible to mix in features from some heroic ideal. The literary world was undergoing a similar revolution. This revolution had many important aspects, but I will focus on only one that is relevant to my topic today, the prominence of epigram. In one respect, epigram had already been around for a long time. The Greek word epigramma, from which we get our word epigram, simply means a thing carved upon something, and was used to refer to words carved into stone or bronze. From the beginning, Greeks very often carved poetry rather than prose, and thus an epigram was implicitly a poetic composition. There were 2 circumstances under which such carvings were generally made. First, when a person died, the person was buried with a marker, usually of stone, placed atop the burial plot. This marker would then be inscribed with a brief message for the reader containing information about the deceased. Second, when a person dedicated an item to a god, it was customary to inscribe a message for the god, reminding him of the dedicator's name and the reason for the dedication, so that the god would remember to grant the dedicator's request. This much had been the case, as far as we know, from the earliest use of the Greek alphabet. Thus we have a tradition of poetry that dealt with objects. Epigram couldn't help it. It was inscribed on objects, and it gave information about those objects. Then, in the 3rd century BC, a significant change. Poets of this period, known as the Hellenistic period, began to compose epigrams as a literary genre. These poems were not written on objects, but rather, like other literary works, circulated in books. However, they retained the generic characteristics of their inscribed predecessors. They were brief poems, almost exclusively at first about graves and dedications, with the conceit of being inscribed upon or talking about an object, even though the object was now absent and had to be imagined by the reader. I should give a brief nod to the definition of epigram that is better known today. Today, an epigram is a pointed and witty quip, often served with a large helping of irony. This definition arose because Hellenistic epigrams tended to be pointed and witty, and when, later, a pointed and witty rhetorical style developed among the Romans, they naturally came to call it epigrammatic. The individual pointed phrases in this rhetoric came to be known as epigrams, a back formation that has nothing to do with inscription. This definition is not relevant to my lecture, though you'll probably recognize its roots in some of my examples. Thus, as we can see, we have the visual arts, where the nature of imitation is changing, and the literary arts, where a class of poetry addressing art objects has come into fashion. What is more, the poets of this period tended overwhelmingly to be scholars. They were sensitive to the humanistic issues explored by Plato and Aristotle, and ready to transform a philosophical point into an artistic one. Let us begin by taking a look at the situation facing Hellenistic epigrammatists before the revolution they would eventually cause. Was representation, or equation, the more common way of speaking of art objects in the world around them? The truth is, no one seems to have paid much attention. Epigrams could go either way. In fact, an epigram could even slide back and forth between the two. This is an inscription on the base of a statue of a young lady named Phrosyclea. It reads, "The marker of Phrosyclea I will always be called maiden, having received this name from the gods, instead of a marriage." Where are we in terms of representation and equation? The epigram begins with the phrase, in the nominative case, the marker of Phrosyclea. This is clearly representation. Immediately following that is, also in the nominative, the word maiden linked by the statement, "I will always be called." Now we seem to be moving somewhat toward equation. After all, the words marker and maiden are being linked. But we must allow for this particular verb. The epigram does not say I am a maiden, but rather I will be called a maiden. In other words, it could be making the same point Aristotle did. Despite the claim of representation in the first phrase, its viewers will think in terms of equation. Equation is not claimed here so much as conceded. This second phrase, then, occupies a transitional space between representation and equation, allowing some room for either. Let's move to the last line. The participial phrase, having received this name from the gods instead of a marriage, could only be said of a maiden. Very clearly so in Greek, because the participle itself is feminine, not neuter. When we take this line together with the second half of the first line, we can still make sense of it, but a different sense. Now, approaching the statement, "I will always be called a maiden," from the vantage point of a girl speaking, rather than a stone, we see that Phrosyclea, in the form of the statue, is claiming that she will always be called maiden because she died before she was able to be married, not because of the statue's maiden-like appearance. The epigram, then, is a curious hybrid of representation and equation. The first phrase is representation, the third is equation, the middle phrase operates as a pivot point. It can fit either its preceding or its following phrase, in either representation or equation, though it means different things when it switches. The one thing it cannot do, however, is bind the epigram together as a coherent, logical whole. Into this interpretive gap stepped the 3rd century poetess Gnosis. She faced the artistic world in which artworks, statues, and paintings were beginning to be made that appeared exactly identical to their models, and she responded with descriptions. She was not as brazen as Magritte, however. She never took a portrait and said, "This is not a person." Rather, she imitated the Phrosyclea epigram, beginning by speaking in terms of representation, then slowly slipping into equation. Then she surpassed the Phrosyclea epigram by demonstrating the consequences of the slip to the reader. We have a series of her epigrams which she probably published together, and show this happening in increasing degrees. I will select 3. First, a description of a portrait of Thalmareta. The plaque has the form of Thalmareta. It has constructed well the pride and youth of the tender-eyed woman. Even the puppy who guards her home were she to see you would wag its tail, thinking she was looking upon the mistress of her house. Gnosis clearly situates us in representation at first. This is not Thalmareta. It is a plaque, or painted surface, that imitates Thalmareta's form. The portrait is particularly true to its model, however. Even the puppy owned by its subject would be fooled. But what about the speaker, who is the viewer of the portrait? Is he similarly fooled? Has he, like the dog, equated the picture with its model? One pronoun gives him away: you. The point of the story should be that the puppy would wag her tail on seeing the portrait, but the speaker has said she would wag her tail upon seeing you. The plaque has been in the third person, not the second, so it is quite unlikely that the speaker is addressing it here. Who else is there? It is easiest to believe that he has begun, while looking at the image, to think of it as Thalmareta, rather than as an image of her. When he jokes about the gullibility of a puppy, he demonstrates the same mistake in his speech. He cannot tell which is which. Gnosis has demonstrated the problem well here. In fact, her work is superior to Magritte's famous painting. While Magritte's message in The Treachery of Images is delivered with a very heavy hand, Gnosis is light and ironic, exploiting the viewer and allowing him to indict himself. Magritte, in all fairness, could do just as well in some less famous works. This painting, Magritte titled, "This is a Piece of Cheese." Instructions on the back of the canvas dictate that it should be displayed under a cheese bell, as it is here. Magritte's strategy here is to deny equation by asserting it to the point of absurdity. Gnosis is not quite as absurd in the last poem we read, but she approaches the issue from the same angle. The next epigram is probably Gnosis's most successful use of these techniques. The speaker in the epigram is a viewer of an image of Sabaithus, and clearly, at least at first, recognizes that it is an image. But this begins a sequence of gradual steps to total equation of the woman with her image. Even from a distance, this image of Sabaithus seems to be recognizable by its form and wise stature. Observe, I expect to see her prudence and gentleness in the same place. Blessed woman, may you fare very well. The speaker approaches the image from a distance. At first, it is clearly a representation. Not only is it explicitly said to be so, but it imitates its model in the way an image can, in form. The second attribute at the end of line 2 is more difficult. Can an image really have wise stature, which is how I'm translating megalophrosune, which would seem to be a quality of the mind? Here we are on shakier ground. There is evidence in Greek literature of megalophrosune being perceived visually in people, presumably through their bearing. Nevertheless, the viewer has ceased to speak of the image strictly as an image, and has begun to verge on identifying it with Sabaithus. With the next line, the viewer commands to observe. This implies a closer observation of the image, so the viewer is probably moving forward. He hopes to see something more in the same place, but is uncertain whether the image is really representing two more qualities of the woman, wisdom and gentleness. These things are certainly more personal qualities than the ones seen in line 2. It would be more difficult to display them in an image. If he really decides that he sees them, then he is certainly thinking in terms of equation. In the last line, then, he has approached the image closely enough to greet it, and he does, greeting it as one would a person, and explicitly calling it a woman. The move to equation is complete. Gnosis has created a dramatic situation to match the gradual process of equation in this epigram. With each line, the viewer seems to approach more closely to the image, and with each line, the viewer comes closer to treating it as a person. In the end, she is a fully realized woman, and the equation is complete. In fact, we are left wondering what actually happened. Did the viewer start off with the correct idea that it was only an image, but then gradually, through increased perception of the accuracy of the image, he was taken in? It is also possible that the opposite has happened. The viewer was at first mistaken in thinking he saw, from afar, a mere representation of Sabaithus, but upon coming closer realized that he was staring at the woman herself, and hastily improvised a "good day, ma'am," just before committing the faux pas of reaching out and stroking the image. Our final inability to know for certain what has happened is testimony to the interpermeability of the concepts of representation and equation. The final epigram in this series continues in the same vein, but also presents unusual complexities. Melinna herself has been constructed. Behold how mild her face. It seems to follow us gently with its eyes. How truly the daughter resembles her mother in every way. It is indeed a good thing when children are like their parents. The first short sentence sets up the reader's expectations. This is a typical gnosis epigram about a particularly true image. The thing that is being called automelina is surely an image made in the likeness of Melina. The reader must expect that the epigram will proceed to elucidate how close the resemblance is. In fact, the epigram diverges slightly from that course. Instead of telling how close the resemblance is between the image and Melina, it tells how beautiful and lifelike the image is. It even seems to track the viewer with its eyes. Then in the second couplet, the reader gets the expected statements about resemblance. But these statements are, at least on the surface, not about the resemblance of a person to a statue. They're about the resemblance of a girl to her mother, introducing the last line in which we find a piece of folk wisdom that children should resemble their parents. How is this last couplet to be understood? The standard interpretation holds that this second couplet is metaphorical. The image is the daughter, and the model is its mother. The likeness of one to the other is as much a tribute to the artist as is the likeness of children to their parents. But this is hardly the only way, or I think even the best way, to read this epigram. A few elements must be noticed. First of all, unlike the other epigrams in this series, this poem never mentions a plaque or an image. The only indication we have of some sort of artistic construction is the verb has been constructed, tetuktai in Greek. But I have overtranslated this verb somewhat. It can also be used of people, and is often equivalent to simply is. We need not be talking about artistic construction at all. What if the subject of the conversation really is a person, the daughter of Melina? There's nothing to prevent such a reading. Reading in this way, the reader begins by thinking that an image is being discussed, not because the epigram tells him so, but because that is a reasonable expectation from Gnosis's usual practice. But then upon reaching the second couplet, he does not read a metaphor, but rather a discovery of reality. The thing under discussion is a child who closely resembles her mother. Looking back at the first couplet, the reader realizes that in fact, all these things could have been said about a child. It is the spitting image of Melina. It has a sweet face, and already at its young age it can follow the viewer with its eyes. This poem then is analogous to the previous one, the Sabithus epigram. In the case of Sabithus, a viewer approached an image, or perhaps the real person, at first believing it an image but gradually changing his mind. We ended with some uncertainty about whether the viewer was more or less deceived at the end than at the beginning. Here the same thing has happened, but we, as readers, are in the place of the viewer. We've begun with the definite impression of an image, but ended with a different impression, and we too cannot be certain whether we are now more or less deceived than at the beginning. This brings me to my final Magritte. In this painting, The Two Mysteries, Magritte displays his earlier painting on a chalkboard, as if it were a lesson. Presumably, it is a lesson we have already learned. We mentally compare the pipe on the chalkboard, which we remember is not a pipe, with the other one. The most natural inclination is to think of that other pipe. Now, that, on the other hand, is a pipe. But if we say so, we haven't really learned our lesson, have we? The second pipe is no more a pipe than the first. We simply cannot overcome our imitative instincts. We fall for the trick every time. Gnosis laid the groundwork for this critique of equation and representation. The essential innovation was hers, but other poets followed in her footsteps, turning her innovation to various uses. I'll begin with Posidippus. He reproduced the technique of the Sabithus epigram, but turned it to a political purpose. As we saw in Gnosis's epigram, we have here a gradual movement from clear representation to clear equation. Let's follow its progress couplet by couplet. Hecataeus molded this bronze completely equivalent to Philetus, precisely down to the fingertips. This couplet makes it clear. The object in question is a piece of bronze, kalkos. It has been shaped exactly like Philetus. There can be no question that the two are different things, with one only representing the other, however accurately. Hewing to the carpenter's square, both in size and flesh, human-wise, he didn't mix in any heroic ideal. This second couplet gives a more specific picture of how exact the resemblance is. The image resembles Philetus in qualities that are clearly visually perceptible, size, and flesh, which seems to imply that its surface, not any more imperceptible inner qualities, is like Philetus's. The gnomon, or carpenter's square, is also introduced, keeping the focus on physicality. This couplet also introduces an alternative to the exactness of the likeness. The image could have been more heroic. In other words, it could have attempted to instill some sort of qualities of character in him that cannot be perceived through an accurate portrait, as, say, the Pericles portrait we saw earlier. The third couplet. Rather, with his whole art, he modeled the highly painstaking old man, keeping to the strict standard of truth. The division between statue and model mostly holds here. The key word modeled, however, imparts an interesting nuance. This verb is in the Greek middle voice. In this voice, this particular verb can take as its object either the original item or its copy. Thus, we cannot tell whether this object, the highly painstaking old man, is intended to designate the original or the copy. We should note, however, that as in the Sabbathus epigram, the description of this statue has subtly progressed from discussion of simple physical dimensions to more personal characteristics. While Gnosis seemed to dramatize the approach of the viewer to the image through space, in this epigram the viewer seems to become more focused as he proceeds. In the second couplet, the statue simply had the correct proportions, but in the third, mention is made of a personality trait, Philetus's own exacting nature. The fourth couplet. It is detailed so true to his character that it seems about to speak, endowed with breath, even though the old man is made of bronze. Here the slip is made more complete. In line 7, the statue is still only seeming, but the qualities on which the comparison is made are less physically apparent. He seems about to speak, if the gap here is filled appropriately. Here the viewer must be seeing some action, or perhaps even intention in the statue. Action that the statue cannot really take in any case, unless it is equated with its model. The statue is given character, and it seems to have breath. Line 8 plants itself firmly on the equation side of the spectrum, while line 1 asserted that this was a piece of bronze, kalkos, in Philetus's proportions. Now it is a bronze person, a kalkeos geron. Even this adjective is dropped in the final couplet. In this spot, by Ptolemy, god and king at once, is the Cohen man dedicated for the sake of the Muses. Now it is not a bronze thing, not even a bronze man, but an actual man who is dedicated to the Muses. The equation is complete. Posidippus, however, is not simply reproducing the effects of Sabbathus's epigram, of Gnosis's Sabbathus epigram. This epigram has two other noteworthy features. First, this is a dedicatory epigram, not simply a description of an artwork. Formulaically, it should feature a person, dedicating a thing to a god for his own benefit. With the total equation of man and image at the end, Posidippus has painted himself into a corner. A man should be making the dedication, not being dedicated. So who dedicates? Here it is Ptolemy, who's described as god and king. But this gives a further problem. God should be receiving dedications, not making them. Here then, the object is dedicated not to the Muses, the god slot is already filled, but for their sake. This again is odd, because usually people dedicate things for their own sakes. The equation at the end of the epigram has required a cascading shift of roles among the characters that usually appear in an epigram of this kind. Posidippus thus shows that when equation substitutes for representation, we run the danger of losing our identity at the same time. Second, we should give special attention to an additional equation that appears at the end here. It seems to have nothing to do with artwork. It is the equation of Ptolemy the king with a god. Earlier scholars have pointed out that the very marked equation of Ptolemy's royal and divine status in the last line is clearly set apart as different from Hecataeus' refusal to endow the statue of Philetus with such lofty qualities. But it should also be noted that this equation occurs at the culmination of a gradual equation of Philetus with his image. In other words, the statue is such an exact duplicate that it comes to be considered the Cohen man himself. By analogy, Ptolemy must be such an exact duplicate of the divine that he can be considered god and king at the same time. To make this point, Posidippus used the techniques pioneered by his predecessor Gnosis, who made us realize that we cannot always tell the difference either. Now I turn to a better-known Hellenistic poet, Theocritus, the father of pastoral poetry. Theocritus wrote a series of epigrams on poets. This allowed him to add a new layer of complexity to the considerations of representation and equation. Theocritus' first interest lay elsewhere, however. Gnosis had demonstrated that thinking in terms of equation was problematic, but she was often subtle. Theocritus aimed to make the point more stark. We see this in a poem he wrote for a statue of Epicharmus. It begins, "The speech is Dorian, and so is the man, Epicharmus, the inventor of comedy. Bacchus, those who inhabit Syracuse, the gigantic city, dedicated to you a bronze hymn instead of a genuine one." Gnosis, we remember, had used a pronoun to indicate a slip to equation. Theocritus does so as well, but places the adjective bronze right next to it. This strikes quite a harsh chord. Lest we miss his rather obvious point of the bronze hymn, Theocritus emphasizes that it is dedicated instead of a genuine one, allowing us to contemplate the impossibility of such a thing. But Theocritus also shows a way out. In the first line of the poem, he alludes to the fact that Epicharmus was a Dorian. So, he says, is the speech. What speech? The answer is much clearer in the original Greek. The epigram itself is composed in the Doric dialect. Perhaps, we may think, this is the way really to replicate Epicharmus, not by making a statue of him, which is emphatically not genuine, but rather by speaking like him. Theocritus pursues this line of thinking in the next epigram as well. As we look on this, I should point out that Theocritus' usual habit in his series of epigrams on poets is explicitly to use words like statue or image, as Gnosis had done, to set up a notion of representation immediately. Here, however, he operates differently. There is no such word, and we may suspect that we are about to fall for the same trick that we saw in Gnosis' Melina epigram. Both stand and look upon Archilochus, the iambic poet of old, whose infinite glory extends over the night into the dawn. Truly the Muses and Delian Apollo loved him, as he was harmonious and dexterous in composing verses and singing to the lyre. The Melina epigram seems to be followed closely here. The epigram begins, stand and look upon. This is a very common command in real inscribed epigram, and always means that the viewer should stop his journey and look at the marker or statue on which the inscription is placed. We're thus led to expect an art object, even though none has explicitly been mentioned, and none will be mentioned throughout the epigram. Here the viewer is commanded to look upon Archilochus the poet. We expect that we're now in the world of equation. Archilochus is being equated with his image. But note the description. No physical attributes are mentioned at all. Only the attributes of Archilochus' poetry. With what, precisely, is Archilochus being equated? As you probably suspect by now, Archilochus is being equated with his poetry itself. This is made all the easier by the meter of this poem, which is notably Archilochian in character. It would not be proper to say that this poem advocates equation over representation, then. It offers a way of escape from the conundrum by giving us the real Archilochus to read and view. A later poet combines the ideas of the previous two Theocritus poems and makes them more explicit. Not even if you set up a beaten gold me, Homer, in fiery lightnings of Zeus, am I, nor will I be, Salaminian, nor will I, Mili's son, be Demisagrus's. May Greece not see these things with its eyes. Subject some other poet to the touchstone, but you, Muses and Chios, sing my poetry to the children of the Greeks. Alcaeus goes one better than Theocritus' bronze hymn with the striking golden me, a phrase made even more physical by the invocation of the hammer, the instrument by which the gilding happens. But immediately after the initial protasis, the entire premise is denied. No matter how closely a statue is equated with Homer, it cannot force him to be things he is not. In denying the veracity of his golden self, Homer again focuses on the physicality of the experience of looking at a statue. The eyes are emphasized as the means by which the deception takes place, and Homer refuses to be put to a touchstone test, that is, to a test where a poet is judged by some physical object. The final line does more than assert Homer's claim to Chios as his birthplace. It also asserts the proper means by which we must experience him. The Muses and the singing of his verses are necessary components for perceiving the real Homer. Theocritus' response, then, is attempted to rescue human understanding. Aristotle said that humans learn through imitation, and Gnosis had severed imitation from its model. Theocritus proposes a purportedly non-imitative way of knowing, with direct experience of literature as the only route to knowing an author. Callimachus, the most innovative author of this period, takes Gnosis' cue in yet another direction. Let's look at this poem, in which he makes his point about representation and equation, without ever letting fall a single representational word. I, Hairos, billeted on Aetion of Amphipolis, stand here, small, on a small porch, holding only a crosswise snake and a sword. Having lost his temper with a cavalryman, he also settled me on foot. All the words here are words used of actual people. Hairos is not molded, placed, or dedicated, but rather billeted or settled. Despite this consistency, the impression does form in the reader's mind that this is a representation, not the real thing. How does this happen? In part, the answer lies in the reader's knowledge outside the text. Some ancient readers might have been acquainted with the Thracian divinity Hairos, and could therefore recognize his name and features, a mounted divinity carrying a snake and sword. But those unfamiliar with this Thracian divinity would need more information, and even those who knew Hairos could have imagined a story that the military divinity Hairos had been billeted at someone's home. The fact of Hairos' representationality is most solidly located in the way he talks about himself. He is unhappy with his appearance, and in particular his lack of a horse. But he blames Aetion for this, saying it is in revenge for his anger at a horseman. The only way that Aition could be responsible for Hieros' circumstance is if Hieros is not a divinity, but a representation of one. No matter how convincingly he may speak of himself as real, the reader would thus perceive a statue here, and a rather poor one at that. Callimachus is using this epigram to explore the properties of imitation itself, as Plato had. Callimachus does not take the easier route of injecting a word like statue. Instead, he forces us to admit for ourselves that Plato is right. Imitations cannot completely reflect their models. Callimachus also clearly apportions blame for this fact. It falls on the creator of the artwork. Callimachus also makes a religious point here. In Greek culture, anthropomorphic deities were regularly represented by artwork produced by mortals. These works of art were conventionally considered to be the deity itself, even to the extent, as Callimachus points out in another poem, that it was not permitted for men to view Athena's statue when it was being washed, because the virgin goddess would be ashamed to be seen bathing. But surely not all these representations were of equal quality or accuracy. What would a god do when he was stuck, living inside a third-rate representation? He could complain, as Callimachus implies, but he cannot escape. A strange consequence for a deity to be thus subject to mortal whim in something so ordinary. Callimachus makes this point even more starkly in this epigram. The graces are four, for beside those three, one has just been molded in addition. It is still moist with perfume. Berenike, fortunate and very noteworthy among everyone, without whom the graces themselves are not graces. Callimachus begins with an assertion that by his time was already shop-worn. The Greeks all knew that there were 3 graces, or 9 muses, etc., but poets would often claim that one more had to be added to that number. The one more was always some woman who was extraordinarily accomplished or beautiful and thus deserved a rank among the gods. Thus, after reading "the graces are 4," the typical reader of Callimachus' time would expect to hear praise of the woman who is to be added to their number. Instead, Callimachus says that there must be 4 graces because an additional statue has just been added to the group of 3 that he had observed. Callimachus thus explicitly claims that the divine order is modeled on the way humans have constructed it. If you want another god, you just have to make one. He's able to do this because of another problem with speaking in terms of equation. When making the simple statement, "This is the god or goddess X," referring to a statue, we understand that it means that the statue imitates divine reality. However, there is no reason that it could not mean that divine reality imitates the statue. This is the problem with the inexact use of language. If it can be bent in one way, it can usually be bent the other. While we have hovered between representation and equation, we have found statements that are by turns confusing, amusing, startling, and perplexing. But, Callimachus shows us, these statements have a serious side too. If words mean anything important, we can lose that thing of importance with a simple slip of the tongue. I'm reminded of Socrates in Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue set at Socrates' death. Crito has just asked Socrates how they should bury him after he dies, and Socrates responds gruffly. Part of his response is here. "Know well," he said, "dear Crito, that improper speech is not only faulty with regard to the matter at hand, but it also does something bad in the souls of people. You must take heart, and say that you are burying my body, and bury it however pleases you and seems most lawful. The matter at hand is whether it is Socrates who is dying, or only his body, and Socrates has a firm answer. But the more important matter for us is Plato's statement. We must pay attention to the precise use of language, recognizing the ways in which it can be turned to other uses. This, I tell my students, is why we insist that they learn the humanities. That way they can understand and express themselves most clearly through life, and learn some ancient jokes to boot." Thank you. I'm happy to take questions now, and by the way, if there are any of you who still can't tell the difference between representation and equation, you will be delighted to know that refreshments will be served on the screen after the lecture.